You can sit this one out, Julia. Chloe will handle the rest. Brandon didn't look up when he said it. He just turned a page and kept talking, like it was already decided. Across the table, the team from Hadmore paused. I saw their lead manager glance at me, just briefly. He'd been working with me on this deal for over a month. This wasn't what he expected. Chloe didn't hesitate. She slid the binder across the table, the one I'd spent 6 weeks building, and placed it right in front of her like it belonged to her all along. No explanation. No warning. Just like that, I was removed from my own work. I stood quietly. Not because I agreed, but because it was pointless to argue in a room that had already turned the page. My name is Julia Vance. I've been with Altira Group for 11 years, leading the legal side of our deals, making sure what we sign won't come back to destroy us later. My job has never been about headlines. It's about the fine print, the tiny details no one else wants to read, the lines that quietly keep this company safe. 6 months ago, Brandon came in as the new operations chief. Everything with him was about cutting costs, simplifying teams, moving fast. Legal work, he saw it as extra weight. Chloe, 10 years younger, sharp, loud, quick with answers, fit his style better. What neither of them realized was this. The only reason we weren't being sued by Hadmore last year was because of one line I added to their contract. Barely a sentence. That one sentence gave us time to fix a mistake on our side without being dragged into court. It didn't sound fancy. It wasn't dressed up in legal talk, but it protected us when nothing else could. It saved this company millions, and it was still sitting in the draft Chloe just took over. For now. Back at my desk, I opened our internal system. Chloe's name was now listed as the main person in charge of the deal. My name had been removed. I couldn't even leave comments anymore. The system had locked me out. The deal was still moving forward. But the safety net I built? That could disappear at any moment. I opened my personal notes, not the company files, but my own records. Every deal I've worked on, every smart adjustment I've made. I didn't keep them for revenge. I kept them because one day, someone would forget why they were there. I started a new entry. Day 1, removed from deal without notice. Key safety clause still active. New team may not understand its purpose. Then I sent a quiet message to our internal team. Please double-check that the clause about delaying legal threats from Hadmore is still included. That's all I said. No emotion, no context. Because I'm not here to stop the damage anymore. I already did that, months ago. They just never realized it. Now they've removed the person who kept the door closed. And one day soon, someone's going to walk right through it. I watched Chloe walk past my desk like she'd always owned it. Same chair, same files, same deal. Except now, my name was gone. She didn't look at me when she sat down, just dropped her laptop bag and called someone loudly on speaker. Her voice bounced off the glass like it belonged. By the end of the day, my access to the contract logs had vanished. My internal credentials returned nothing but blank fields. It was official. I was erased. I didn't fight it. Not because I agreed, but because I already knew what would follow. Brandon's new cost reduction playbook wasn't subtle. I was just the first checkmark on a list he never bothered to hide. Restructure non-revenue functions. I'd seen the slide in a closed-door prep once before my badge lost its access. The ink hadn't even dried on my name before he was already pointing to the next line. Streamline legal. He didn't know what I'd left behind. And I don't mean files. I mean memory. The kind of memory that doesn't need a login. That clause in the Hadmore contract, 13.4, was the only reason we weren't dragged into a courtroom last year. Not a theory. A fact. Their logistics claim would have buried us. But that clause bought us time. Quietly, efficiently. And now it was in Chloe's hands. 3 days after I left, she approved a revision, one that removed the clause. She probably thought it was redundant. Legal padding. She never saw the original emails from Hadmore's counsel, never sat through their veiled threats, never understood the trap they like to set, delay a delivery, then flip the blame. I dealt with them before. But Chloe, she was focused on speed. Aaron sent me a message the night it disappeared, just one line. Clause 13.4 is gone. I stared at that sentence for a long time. Then I wrote one of my own. And so is the only protection they had. I didn't reply to Aaron. He had stayed silent when they cut me. He had the rank to speak, but not the will. Now, he had a front row seat to what silence costs. The strange thing about watching a system fail is how quiet it begins. The first crack came from compliance, a question about delivery thresholds. Then Hadmore started sending unusually polite queries about reimbursement terms, the kind of language that sounds harmless if you've never heard it turn lethal. Brandon dismissed it, called it noise, operations noise. I called it a fuse, but again, I said nothing. Instead, I waited, and then I sent one package. Not to legal, not to the board, to someone unexpected. Chloe. Inside the envelope was the full copy of the original Hadmore contract, printed, annotated, with clause 13.4 underlined in pencil. No note, no warning, just one highlight. I knew she'd recognize it. She had seen it once before, briefly in a meeting last year when I'd walked her through risk shielding. She'd been distracted, but not blind. She didn't respond. Not to me. But she did pull something. A week later, an internal audit team quietly received a flagged memo. Review recommended on recent contract clause removals, priority, high. No name attached. But I knew her footprint. She wasn't exposing Brandon. She was distancing herself, and that was all I needed. Because once people start separating from the fire, it means the smoke's already spreading. And Brandon? He still thought he'd made a clean cut. But you don't cut out the person holding the pressure valve and expect the pipes to hold. Not for long. Chloe didn't say a word. Not to Brandon, not to legal. But something shifted. Her updates stopped appearing in internal newsletters. She stopped joining Brandon's weekly calls. I heard from someone in HR that she'd started pulling old project archives. Not digital ones, the paper binders stored in cold rooms no one visited anymore. She was chasing something. She had found the edge of a hole and didn't know how deep it went. Meanwhile, Hadmore's emails turned sharper, less friendly, more formal. They weren't threatening yet, but they didn't need to. They knew Altira had removed the clause. They were just waiting for us to pretend we hadn't. Aaron was the next to feel it. He called in sick 3 days in a row, not because he was ill, but because he knew what was coming. He had been there when I wrote clause 13.4. He'd seen how it held when Hadmore tried the exact same tactic last year, and now he was one of the few left who could connect the dots. But he chose silence. Again. This time, the silence was louder. The audit team that Chloe quietly tipped off started asking questions. Nothing aggressive, just patterns, dates, decision chains. And somehow, clause 13.4 kept surfacing. Brandon didn't notice. He was too busy flying to regional offices, boasting about how Altira was finally lean and litigation-proof. I heard that phrase from a friend in comms. They rolled their eyes when they said it. People were starting to talk, softly but constantly. Then Hadmore made their move. They filed a formal complaint. It didn't use the word lawsuit, but the numbers were clear. They were asking for millions. Damages tied to performance delays, liability for freight issues, and an obscure clause they claimed had been unilaterally modified without disclosure. That clause was mine. And now it was gone. Legal panicked. Operations panicked. Chloe stayed quiet. But Aaron broke. He sent an internal message to audit. A timeline. Not official, not structured. Just bullet points. When the clause was written, when it was triggered, when it was removed, and when he knew. He didn't name me. He didn't have to. The audit team pulled contract history. They compared draft versions. They traced metadata. They found a change log that showed Brandon had approved the final version without reviewing legal's risk notes. And just like that, the story wasn't about one clause anymore. It was about how the company deleted its own safeguard, pretended it never existed, and walked into the exact fire I'd spent a year building walls around. I wasn't part of the company anymore, but my name was everywhere now, and they were just beginning to realize what they'd erased. Brandon didn't panic right away. He doubled down. Hadmore's complaint hit the executive inboxes by noon on a Thursday. By the time the afternoon meetings began, Brandon had already framed it as a bluff. He told the board it was pressure tactics, that they were testing boundaries. He dismissed the numbers. 5.7 million in damages. According to him, logistics would sort it out. He was wrong. Instead of checking the contract history, he ordered legal to build a counter-argument. Their instructions were clear. Shift the blame, find a loophole, reframe the fault as operational, not contractual. Aaron watched in silence. He had already tried once to raise a warning, and all it earned him was a quiet visit from HR. A career development conversation, someone called it. He didn't try again, but Chloe did something no one expected. She stopped replying to Brandon altogether. The girl who once echoed his every line in meetings suddenly went still. She canceled her next legal sync. She stopped pushing process memos. Instead, she started reading. Quietly, deeply, through old chains of emails from when I handled Hadmore directly. She found what I knew she would, an exchange from last year. Hadmore had attempted the same delay maneuver then, blaming Altira for missed freight schedules caused by their own internal bottlenecks. I had predicted it. That's why I wrote Clause 13.4 in the first place, to suspend their ability to escalate unless third-party mediation confirmed liability. And it worked. They backed off then. That clause was gone now. And Chloe had the email chain that proved it. She didn't send it to Brandon, she sent it to internal audit. Again. She also included the revision history, with Brandon's digital sign-off. From that point forward, audit stopped acting quietly. They flagged the Hadmore contract for full review. They halted all new vendor agreements pending cross-checks, and someone on the board, someone higher than Brandon expected, requested an emergency legal risk report. Brandon didn't take it well. The next morning, Chloe's access was restricted. Officially, it was a standard systems audit. Unofficially, it was retaliation. She knew it. So did Aaron. And so did I. Because while all of this was happening, I received something unexpected at my new office. A thin envelope with no return name. Inside it, a copy of the revised Hadmore contract, the one missing clause 13.4, and a post-it written in handwriting I recognized instantly. This wasn't a mistake. They did it to look clean. There was no signature. But Chloe didn't need to sign it. She was no longer defending Brandon. She was preparing to survive him. And the clause they thought no one remembered? It wasn't a ghost anymore. It had found its voice. And this time, it was speaking through someone they underestimated just as badly as they once did me. The audit report landed on the board's table on a rainy Monday morning. No headlines, no alarms, just a line buried deep in a bullet point summary. Removal of previously embedded risk clause correlates with current legal exposure. Clause origin undocumented. Estimated litigation vulnerability, high. No name, no credit. Just a trail leading to something that was no longer there. I read that sentence 3 times. It was strange seeing your own work show up like a ghost. Not celebrated. Not even acknowledged. Just traced, like footprints in sand after the tide rolls back. No one mentioned my name, but every paragraph echoed something I once protected. That week, Aaron requested access to archived negotiation logs. Not the emails, the records no one reads, the back-and-forth transcripts, the small details that never make presentations. He found 6 major deals I had led in the last 3 years. None of them had escalated, none had gone legal, and none had clauses credited to me. Because I never asked for credit, I just did the work. Now they were scrambling to reconstruct a system that had only worked because no one noticed it breaking. Hadmore wasn't waiting. They escalated the complaint to a formal legal submission. No more suggestions. No more open dialogue. They were demanding damages, almost $6 million, under the claim that Altira had knowingly altered contractual protections without disclosure. Brandon tried to blame operations, but when Chloe forwarded the original email where I had warned, months before, that clause 13.4 must never be changed, the room went quiet. Someone on the board reportedly asked, "Why wasn't this flagged?" No one answered, because the answer was simple. They removed the only person who knew what to flag. And now the legal team was combing through old records, trying to map protections they'd never bothered to understand. They were hunting for context, trying to rebuild what had already been dismantled. I watched it all unfold without stepping in, not because I didn't care, but because it wasn't mine to fix anymore. I had warned them. I had documented everything. But the company didn't run on memory. It ran on attribution, and I'd never played that game. Still, the damage was growing. Vendors hesitated to renew deals. A procurement hold was placed on 3 critical contracts. Clients began asking questions Altira wasn't ready to answer. Because now, the problem wasn't just Hadmore. It was the realization that other deals might be missing the same safeguards, not because of neglect, but because those deals had once relied on me. And no one remembered that until the shields came down. Not in a blaze, not with noise, but with silence, and a name that never appeared in the footnotes. Mine. The claim didn't shake the board, not at first. 5.7 million was a lot, but Altira had faced worse on paper. What rattled them was something else. There was no defense. The clause that would have stopped this had vanished. No substitute, no explanation. And the only version of the contract with that line still intact had my handwriting on it. Brandon called an emergency session with legal and audit. He tried to take control, said it was a miscommunication between risk and contracts, said Hadmore was bluffing, said we'd counter, reframe, redirect. But he didn't know Chloe had already made her move. 3 hours before that meeting, she submitted a sealed packet to the board's legal liaison. Inside it were 6 printouts, emails, meeting minutes, 1 calendar invite, 1 voice memo transcription. Every page pointed to the same thing. Clause 13.4 had been deliberately removed against internal warning after Julia Vance was terminated. And every decision tied back to one name. Not mine, Brandon's. Audit reviewed the packet and didn't wait. They initiated a full internal trace. They weren't just looking for gaps in the Hadmore deal now. They wanted to know how many other contracts had clauses written by someone who no longer worked at the company. Clauses no one could explain. Clauses no one dared admit they didn't understand. That's when Aaron cracked. He asked to speak privately with the board counsel. For someone who'd said nothing for weeks, he suddenly remembered everything. The arbitration scare from last year. The draft clause Julia had hand-edited at 11:42 p.m. the night before signature. The language Brandon didn't like because it sounded too cautious. The meeting where Julia warned explicitly that Hadmore's legal team was trained to weaponize delivery delays. Every detail Aaron had buried under silence now came out. But it was too late to rewrite the past. Because Hadmore wasn't backing down. They had hired one of the most aggressive litigation firms in their jurisdiction. Arbitration would be expensive, time-consuming, public, the last thing Altira's board wanted. That week, shares slipped 3%. 2 clients paused renewals. 3 vendors demanded immediate indemnity reassessments. The cracks weren't in the contract anymore. They were in the reputation. And then the final blow landed. An independent audit team pulled a risk curve across Julia's entire tenure. 16 high-risk deals, 0 lawsuits, legal cost avoidance projected at just over $6 million. None of it was tracked, none of it was attributed. It had lived in the silence, held together by someone who wasn't there to speak for it. They showed the graph at a private board session. No names, just bars. A spike in protected risk from 2015 to early 2023, then a drop, then a lawsuit. One board member finally said what no one else wanted to hear. "We didn't cut cost, we cut the firewall." No one spoke after that. Not Brandon, not legal, not audit. Because there was no argument left. The numbers were clear, but the person who saved them, she wasn't on any slide. And still, somehow, she was everywhere. The board didn't issue a statement. They didn't need to. By the time the lawsuit hit the press, the silence spoke louder than any announcement. Altira was being taken to arbitration by one of its largest logistics partners. The numbers were public now. So was the paper trail. Investors didn't need the details. They saw the trend, losses, exposure, and worst of all, no one at the company who could explain how it happened. Brandon tried to spin it. He issued a short message calling it a legacy contract error. Said Altira was working proactively to resolve a minor contract oversight. It didn't land. Because Hadmore's legal team did something he didn't expect. They leaked the original clause, Clause 13.4, in full, highlighted, underlined, with the date of removal listed beside it. It spread fast. Internal forums, Slack threads, even a few legal blogs picked it up. The clause that could have saved Altira. That was the headline. Chloe read it in her car before work. She didn't go in that day. Neither did Aaron. Brandon was alone now, still claiming control, still insisting they didn't need help. When one board member suggested bringing Julia back as a consultant, he shut it down immediately, said it would set a bad precedent, said they didn't need to rely on ghosts. But he underestimated just how loud a ghost can be. Because Chloe still had the original voice recording, an internal compliance session from the year before. Julia had spoken for 5 minutes, calmly, directly, explaining exactly why Clause 13.4 existed. "This isn't to look smart," she'd said. "This is because if Hadmore flips and we don't have this line, we lose all leverage. They'll make it look like a breach, even if it's their failure. And once it's framed that way, the contract's worthless." That clip had been buried in a compliance archive. Chloe released it anonymously. It reached audit, then legal, then the board. Within 48 hours, everything changed. An emergency vote was called. Brandon wasn't removed yet, but he was asked to step down from direct involvement in the litigation response. For the first time since the crisis began, someone else took the lead. A board member with oversight on external legal appointments proposed a new name: Julia Vance. Not as an employee, as an external advisor. No title, no rank, just access and authority. Enough to look at what was left of the Hadmore file and decide if it could still be saved. When they reached out, they didn't beg. They didn't apologize. They didn't explain. They just asked if she was willing to review a case. Julia didn't say yes. Not right away. But the next day, a car pulled up to Altira headquarters. She didn't go to the boardroom. She didn't shake hands. She walked into a side office, requested silence, and asked for one thing: all copies of the contract across every revision. She read them once, then rewrote the entire response in 90 minutes. Not with anger, not with revenge, with precision. With knowledge no one else had preserved. Because while everyone else had moved on, Julia had remembered what mattered. And now, the clause they deleted had returned. Not as a line on paper, but as a reckoning no one could escape. Julia didn't ask for a title. She didn't ask for reinstatement. She didn't even sit at the long table when they handed her the files. She chose a side room, no glass, no view, just quiet, and opened the last version of the Hadmore contract like she already knew where the damage would be. She read for 10 minutes, then she made 3 edits. One to the framing of liability, one to the interpretation window on missed performance, and one, brutal in its elegance, to a footnote clause Brandon had approved without reading. The one that had opened the door. When she was done, she pushed the paper forward and said only this: "This is the number they'll take. You'll avoid arbitration, but only if it's sent before Friday." No justification, no pitch. She didn't wait to see their reaction. She left the office the same way she walked in. Unnoticed by most, remembered by everyone who mattered. The board reviewed her redraft and moved immediately. It wasn't dramatic. They didn't call a press conference. They simply sent Julia's version, without edits, to Hadmore. And 3 days later, the impossible happened. Hadmore responded. They would accept a settlement. No arbitration, no public filings, no admission of fault. Just a one-time fee of $100,000 for technical reconciliation. Not $5.7 million. $100,000. The legal team was stunned. So was operations. Brandon didn't speak for hours. When he did, it was only to ask, why would they back off now? He didn't get an answer, but Chloe, who had stayed silent through the entire meeting, slipped a single line across the table when it ended. A transcript from Julia, dated from the year before. "If they ever flip, it won't be about the facts, it'll be about leverage. That clause isn't about trust, it's about timing." The board didn't cheer, they didn't clap, they just sat there, quietly, realizing the entire collapse had been preventable. And the only reason they weren't drowning now was because the person they cut had chosen not to let them. The next morning, Julia submitted her final memo. No charge, no invoice, just a stamped note, folded neatly at the top. Crisis resolved, authority reverted, all files destroyed. It was the cleanest closure Altira had seen in a year. But it came with something else, something no one could print. The understanding that the firewall they discarded had returned. Once. Not because she had to, but because she chose to. And she wouldn't be coming back again. The email from Hadmore was framed, quietly. No announcement, no celebration. Just printed, mounted, and hung in the legal war room like a warning. $100,000. That's what it took to stop the spiral. But no one celebrated. They couldn't. Because the numbers no longer spoke for success, they spoke for how close they came to collapse. The file with Julia's revisions was marked closed. Her name wasn't even on the final submission, but everyone in the building knew who had written it. Brandon tried to carry on. He chaired 3 meetings in the week that followed. None of them led to decisions. Approvals were stalled. Legal held every contract longer than usual. Even operations, once loyal to his every directive, started pushing back. He was still in the building, but power had already left the room. Meanwhile, Chloe changed her commute. No announcement, no goodbye. She simply stopped showing up to Altira's offices. Her departure form reached HR through courier, signed and dated with no note attached. She didn't disappear. She reappeared at a quiet address tucked behind two coffee shops and a financial planner's office. The name on the door was simple: Vance Legal Strategies. It wasn't a law firm in the traditional sense. It didn't advertise. It didn't pitch. It existed for one reason: to build contracts no one could destroy from the inside. Chloe didn't ask for a job. She brought a binder. Inside were all the internal memos Julia had once written, scans she'd saved, out of habit more than loyalty, and a list, typed, clean, quiet, of every clause that had once saved Altira money without anyone noticing. Julia didn't look through it. She just asked one question: "Are you here to build walls or to decorate them?" Chloe didn't answer out loud. She unpacked her bag. Back at Altira, the board was still struggling to rebuild what had quietly died. A consulting firm had been hired to conduct a knowledge retention assessment. The result wasn't a report, it was a void. Dozens of contracts with embedded protections, undocumented, years of adjustments, amendments, negotiated fail-safes, all uncredited. Julia's name appeared nowhere, but her fingerprints were on everything. They tried to reverse engineer her thinking. They couldn't, because what she'd done wasn't just legal work, it was structural, preventative, defensive in ways no spreadsheet could model. The head of compliance described it best, almost by accident. During a debrief, someone said, "She was just legal, right?" The room went quiet. Then someone else replied, "No, she wasn't legal. She was a firewall. And we fired her." That word stuck. It showed up in emails, in meeting notes, even in a draft revision of the org chart. Not a title, a role, one they didn't realize existed until it was gone. They tried to build it back. Task forces, documentation sprints, trainings. But you can't teach instinct. You can't retrofit foresight. And you can't restore what only one person ever knew how to carry. Julia didn't ask for recognition. She never returned for a final statement. But she left something louder than a speech. She left absence. The kind that echoes, not because of volume, but because of precision. Not a lawyer, not a voice in the room, a firewall. And this time, when the sparks hit, they finally saw what happens when no one's left to hold the line. Brandon was never fired. He was moved, stripped of decision-making, reassigned to a strategic advisory capacity, and quietly removed from all external communication. There was no headline, no scandal, just a line in a memo about internal role transitions and a calendar invite that no one accepted. Inside the company, the silence said everything. People stopped asking where he was. They'd already seen what happened when a company places confidence in noise instead of caution. What lingered wasn't the lawsuit. It was the fear of the next one. A dozen internal projects were frozen. A quarter of external partnerships delayed signing. Every contract now required a double review. Not because the system changed, but because no one trusted it anymore. Julia didn't return. Not even when asked. They sent 2 offers. First to consult long-term, then to come back in-house as general counsel. She declined both. Not with anger, with precision. She simply sent back the final memo she'd submitted at the end of the Hadmore case, the one legal had filed and forgotten. Except this time, she added one line, handwritten across the bottom. Cost center, avoided litigation liability, $6.12 million attribution. Not required outcome, stable. That was it. No call, no explanation, and no one dared ask for more. The board let the offer expire. Internally, they created a new role, one modeled after the gaps Julia had exposed. They gave it a name, gave it a budget, assigned 2 full-time staff to it. But even they knew it wasn't a firewall, it was just insurance. A month later, Chloe's name appeared on a vendor recommendation list, this time as lead advisor for a partner client. Not under Altira, under Vance Legal Strategies. Julia had never added her name to the firm's branding, but everyone knew who it belonged to. The clients that mattered did anyway. The people who'd watched Altira unravel understood one thing now. It wasn't the presence of a clause that had saved them. It was the instinct to put it there in the first place, and that instinct had a name. They had erased it once. They wouldn't make that mistake again. Because this story didn't end with revenge, it ended with survival. And a company still standing, not because of who was in charge, but because of the one person they thought they could do without. They fired the firewall, and then learned in silence what she had held back all along.